webinar on design options for the European Hydrogen Bank, a webinar that is commonly organized by EPICO KlimaInnovation, Guidehouse, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. My name is Klaus-Dieter Borchardt. I'm Associate Senior Advisor at EPICO, and in this function, I will lead you today through this webinar. As you know, the idea of creating a European Hydrogen Bank is around since September last year, when the President of the European Commission, Ms. von der Leyen, has announced it in her State of the Union address. At the beginning, it was not very clear what this hydrogen bank should do and how it should be organized. But in the meantime, especially also since the 16th of March, when the Commission has published its communication on the hydrogen bank, we have already much clearer ideas of what this hydrogen bank is supposed to do. Its vocation, of course, is first and foremost to facilitate and support the production and the uptake of renewable hydrogen within the EU, but also organizing imports from third countries. As such, the bank will play a central role under both the Repower EU plan, which foresees the production of 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen within the EU, and again 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen imported from third countries. But it also plays a central role, this bank, under the just proposed Net Zero Industry Act, which aims to ensure that the EU has sufficient manufacturing capacity for strategic technologies in order to deliver on the Green Deal. And when I talk about strategic technologies, of course, hydrogen electrolyzers is part of it. The main aim of the bank is to unlock private investments in the hydrogen value chains in the EU and in third countries by addressing the initial investment challenges and needs, which are first, scaling up manufacturing capacities for electrolyzers, scaling up new hydrogen production capabilities, opening new demand sectors for renewable hydrogen, and developing dedicated hydrogen infrastructure. The Commission estimates the investment needs to produce, transport, and consume 10 million of renewable hydrogen between 335 billion and 471 billion euros. The most urgent challenge is, of course, to cover the cost gap between renewable hydrogen on the one side and fossil fuels on the other side for early projects and de-risking these projects. EPICO KlimaInnovation and Guidehouse have analyzed concrete design options on how the bank could proceed here. And that brings me to our program of today. After short welcome remarks by Kevin Oswald, who is a policy advisor for energy and resources at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Bastian Lotz, senior consultant at Guidehouse, will give us a presentation on the European Hydrogen Bank report. This will be followed by an analysis on the European Hydrogen Bank's design by Bernd, who is the CEO of EPICO KlimaInnovation. And as I have said, we also have the communication of the Commission side. We also have invited Ruud Kempener, member of the Cabinet of Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simson, who will tell us a bit about the ideas behind the communication, and maybe also already linking up with a recommendation from EPICO and Guidehouse, how this is interlinked with the Commission's ideas. We then will have a look into the opportunities and challenges for the implementation of the European Hydrogen Bank. This will be done by Corinna Klessmann. She is director at Guidehouse. And then last but not least, and I'm really happy that Mr. Alvaro Marco could join us here today, we also want to take in the view from the business. And Marco is the CEO of TESS. This is a hydrogen development company, and it will be very interesting to take his view in how he sees the design of the hydrogen bank, and whether this bank is a key feature in the development and the development of the hydrogen market in Europe. We will then open the general discussion, and I will come back to that when we come. And at the end will be closing remarks by Bernd Weber. So with any other further ado, I invite now Kevin Oswald to give us his welcome remarks. Kevin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Borchardt, and good afternoon to everybody who's joining us today. On behalf of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Design Options for a European Hydrogen Bank. And I would like to point out that we are very thankful that our colleagues from EPICO KlimaInnovation have managed to organize this online event. Especially here in Germany, but probably also in almost any other EU member states, the discussions of the past weeks and months have made it very clear that hydrogen will play a key role when it comes to decarbonization of the industry, but also of other sectors, potentially transport and heating. But there are still many open questions regarding the ramp up of a hydrogen economy in Europe, but also regarding imports from other parts of the world. For this reason, and to stimulate the debates, Konrad Adenauer Foundation and EPICO have partnered with Guidehouse already last year in order to take a close look at potential design options for a European hydrogen bank that will be a key instrument. And the result of this was a policy report published in February this year. I'm very glad that Bastian Lotz will now present the key findings of this report, and then we will have an opportunity to discuss with our distinguished panelists. So once again, thanks a lot to EPICO, to Guidehouse, to Mr. Kempener and Mr. Alvaro for being here today. And I wish you all now a fruitful discussions and a very insightful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And now, Bastian, you can start your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introductions and the welcoming remarks. My name is Bastian Lotz. I'm a senior consultant at Guidehouse in Berlin. I have the pleasure today, if I can skip, yeah. I have the pleasure today to give you a brief overview of our policy report on design options for the European Hydrogen Bank. I have co-authored this with my colleague Corinna Klessmann, who will also be on the panel later, and you will hear from her as well. It was already mentioned, we initially wrote this report in reaction to the State of the Union address in September of last year, where the European Hydrogen Bank concept was first introduced as a flagship initiative for this year. And at this point, most design parameters were not yet specified. We have some more clarity now with the already mentioned Commission communication on the European Hydrogen Bank. Still, many design elements are relatively open. So against this background, we tried to achieve three main goals with our policy report, which are first, to outline potential high-level functions and objectives, to assess possible design choices, and based on that derive conclusions and recommendations on a suitable design choice for both the domestic and the inputs pillar of the European Hydrogen Bank. So in this report, we have looked at three different support instruments that could be implemented under the European Hydrogen Bank. The first are double-sided auctions for supply and demand contracts of green hydrogen or its derivatives. Second are one-sided supply or demand-side auctions to determine market premiums for producers or off-takers of green hydrogen. And the third option are default guarantees for hydrogen producers. The first design option that we assessed, double-sided auction for supply and demand contracts. to give you a short description of the instrument. Here, what the European Hydrogen Bank would do, or itself, or as in the form of an intermediary, would be first to auction longer-term purchase contracts to hydrogen or derivative producers in a supply-side auction. You can see this depicted here on the left side. It would then, in a second step, sell these procured volumes as part of shorter-term sale contracts to off-takers. This is determined in a demand-side auction, which you can see on the right side here. And in a final step, it would allocate the public funds that are needed to cover the price gap that is determined between hydrogen costs on the supply side and willingness to pay on the demand side in both of these auctions. And since hydrogen purchase and sale contracts would be awarded to lowest cost suppliers and off-takers with the highest willingness to pay, under the assumption, obviously, of sufficient competition in both auctions, the determined support gap of hydrogen could be minimized with this instrument. Some key assessments on double-sided auctions. Double-sided auctions are very effective, first of all, in covering the cost gap between green hydrogen and fossil-based alternatives. They also reduce investment risks for both producers and off-takers quite substantially, because the intermediary in this concept would not only match market participants, but also close direct sale and purchase contracts with them. And that means in turn that the corresponding responsibilities, liabilities, and contractual risks are largely assumed by the support scheme itself and not by market participants. It allows for competitive price discovery and thus, in principle, efficient auction outcomes. On the downside, the funding requirements would be rather high initially, because the intermediary assumes, as I mentioned, a lot of marketing, price, and default risks for market participants. And this also means that a relatively large budget would have to be reserved to ensure support payments throughout the support period and to basically cover these potential risks throughout the support periods. So all in all, double-sided auctions are, for that reason, relatively complex to design and implement, and that is mainly because the support scheme also requires the support giver to enter into these contracts with off-takers and producers. The second design option that we have looked into are supply or demand-side auctions that allocate market premiums. Market premiums could be relatively simple fixed premiums on top of the purchase prices that are agreed bilaterally between producers and off-takers. Or in other words, those are one-sided auctions on either the supply or the demand side. And at its core, these one-sided auctions, in contrast to double-sided auctions, would imply that producers and off-takers need to close bilateral purchase agreements to be eligible for support. And this is not taken over by the support scheme itself. On the left side, you can see supply-side auctions here. Supply-side auctions address hydrogen producers that would receive, once they are awarded, a premium for each unit of hydrogen produced, and producers that require the lowest premium to fulfill a bilateral purchase agreement would be awarded. The demand-side auction, on the other hand, on the right side, address green hydrogen users, for example, a steel plant that would receive a premium for each unit of hydrogen consumed. And again, here the off-takers, not the producers, that require the lowest premium to close the gap between their own willingness to pay and the required off-take price for green hydrogen would be awarded. Again, some assessments for these one-sided auctions. One-sided auctions are also effective because, similar to the double-sided auctions, they're able to close the cost gap of green hydrogen. But what they don't do is that they don't hedge against default and marketing risks, and they do not provide explicit matchmaking. And this is in contrast to double-sided auctions. But since they allow for an auction-based allocation of premiums, they in principle also minimize support euro per kilogram of hydrogen produced or consumed, again, under the condition of sufficient competition. An advantage of these one-sided auction is that from a budget certainty point of view, they they don't require the support giver to reserve additional budget to ensure support payments over time, because the market participants, off-takers and producers would negotiate and close purchase contracts themselves, and so would not, so the support scheme would not have to cover the resulting risks and liabilities of these contractual relationships. And especially if combined with a fixed premium, the design and implementation is relatively straightforward for both the support giver and market participants. The last design option that we have assessed are default guarantees for hydrogen producers. Default guarantees have some similarities to the existing export guarantees. Here, in the context of hydrogen imports, for example, they would work in the opposite direction. However, so rather than protecting exports, they would hedge hydrogen producers outside the EU that invest outside the EU against certain difficult to estimate risks or default events in hydrogen take or pay contracts. And such risks could be, for example, the non-completion of import or transport infrastructure, transportation or non-availability of transportation, or the in case of a Can you hear me? Okay, because I was somehow muted. So in case of a default event, the default guarantee allows the producer to be compensated for the loss of not being able to sell the hydrogen produced, or at least at a lower price than initially agreed. So overall, default guarantees reduce investment risk, but in themselves do not close the funding gap. So they would at least initially have to be combined with other support instruments, such as premium payments, that are able to close that gap. However, default guarantees can be very useful in leveraging the hydrogen market ramp up by hedging against unprotected risks and therefore reduce investment barriers. And finally, default guarantees are relatively straightforward in their design. And when designing them, they could potentially draw from established experience with export guarantees. Coming to my last two slides, I would like to close with 5 takeaways and policy recommendations that we have identified in our report. First takeaway is that for the domestic pillar under the European Hydrogen Bank, we believe that supply-side auctions that allocate fixed premiums are the most suitable design option. They provide high support cost effectiveness, good market orientation, and they're relatively easy to implement and administer, especially if they're combined with fixed premiums. And in contrast to double-sided auctions, they do not take away all market risks for domestic investors, and so they avoid some of the downsides of double-sided auctions. It's also the support framework that is currently envisaged by the European Commission under the domestic pillar. For the imports pillar, we see that double-sided auctions could be considered under certain circumstances. Those circumstances may exist especially for exporting countries with unreliable regulatory frameworks or high political and delivery risks. And in that case, they may increase effectiveness and therefore tap into investments of first movers that would otherwise not be taken. Still, in most cases, we think that supply-side auctions, so one-sided supply-side auctions that allocate fixed premium would still be would nonetheless be a suitable design option for the imports pillar as well. And that is especially against the background of the rather limited funding that is currently foreseen under the European Hydrogen Bank, and in general, the high initial funding gaps. And here, supply-side auctions, in our view, could be the more efficient options, would allow for a more efficient use of available public funds. Default guarantees, in our view, could be an additional valuable risk hedging instrument under the imports pillar to cover difficult to estimate default and delay risk for private purchase agreements. And so these guarantees can provide additional investment security, and they can help tap into additional import potentials that would otherwise remain unused. And finally, Default guarantees can also serve as a parallel standalone support instrument for hydrogen producers that now or in the future are without funding needs. And therefore, default guarantees can actually help facilitate a self-sustaining hydrogen market in the medium to long term. That would be it from my side. Thank you very much for listening. And I will hand over to Klaus-Dieter Borchardt again.
Thank you very much, Bastian. Very clear recommendations. And I invite immediately Bernd, who wants to comment further on the recommendations and also on the design options. Bernd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Klaus-Dieter. I think we are having indeed a very timely discussion because we are at a very important point where we need to accelerate a pragmatic agenda for ramping up hydrogen in Europe. And this is especially true when you consider the increasing competition that we are facing here in Europe, which stems from, on the one side, from the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is providing a lot of funding for new hydrogen projects, for new electrolyzers. And this comes at a time where we do see indeed a large gap between the numbers of new projects on the one side and the electrolyzer manufacturing capacity on the other side. And besides that, we also need to face increasing competition when it comes to supplies from abroad. And it's crystal clear that Europe will not be able to develop a sufficient amount of hydrogen to satisfy its own domestic demand, but we will need to import a lot of hydrogen. And we are not the only ones to do so. Europe is one important consumption center, but there are other important consumption centers, which are particularly located in Asia. And this is why Europe also needs to be attractive as an off-taker destination, as a destination for hydrogen supplies from abroad. And obviously the European Hydrogen Bank as the new flagship instrument of the EU for the hydrogen ramp up is key to achieve this. Now, when confronted with this, with the situation, with these challenges, we need a well-informed debate on the design of the European Hydrogen Bank, and this is exactly why we contributed with our report to such a debate. And I think one key message from the report is that the design of the European Hydrogen Bank really needs to be as effective, as efficient, and as market-oriented as possible, because we have a very limited amount of public funding for the European Hydrogen Bank, and we need to use it as effectively as possible to leverage private funding and also to increase the bankability of projects to de-risk private investment, which is very much needed. And indeed, if you look at the numbers, the challenge is enormous. If we want to achieve the goals of 10 million tons renewable hydrogen produced domestically in the EU, and also importing 10 million tons of green hydrogen to Europe by 2030, we estimate overall 1,300 billion euro, which will be needed in terms of investment, including new capacity for renewables, or in other words, that's twice the amount of the recovery and resilience fund established in the aftermath of COVID-19. And at the same time, we are looking at a budget for the European Hydrogen Bank, which is pretty limited. What we know so far is that we can expect 3 billion from the Innovation Fund for the domestic side. It is rather uncertain whether the Innovation Fund can also be used for imports, because the Innovation Fund as such has been established to promote innovations within Europe, not necessarily outside Europe. So there's also more clarification needed. But overall, we are discussing here enormous investment, which definitely needs to come from the private sector. Now, we think, based on the report, that the best way to address the funding gap between the production costs on the one side and the willingness to pay on the other side, and also to address the insecurity for the investment, especially from a supplier perspective, would be supply side auctions determining market premiums. And I would like to elaborate why we think that this is the case. for the domestic pillar, but also for the import pillar. When it comes to the domestic pillar, I think this is an efficient instrument to close the cost gap of green hydrogen, and also these premiums, they can help us to minimize the support in terms of euro that is needed to produce a kilogram of green hydrogen, as long as we can ensure sufficient competition. And indeed, the supply side auction in the domestic pillar at least can also work as a standalone instrument, which basically means that no further instruments are necessarily needed for the market take-up. And I think this is really important. It also highlights the high level of market orientation of this instrument. And this is important because we think that in the longer term, there should be a self-sustaining hydrogen market. There should be a self-sustaining hydrogen economy, which is facilitated by the emission trading scheme, the ETS price on the one side, and the carbon border adjustment, so the CBAM on the other side. Now, when we look at the import pillar, I think it's a little bit more complicated because we basically here, as Bastian already pointed out, have two valid options. So one is the double-sided auctions, and my understanding in the report of the Commission is that this might be a long-term option, but not necessarily an option to kick off the hydrogen bank. So the double-sided auction scheme is basically what H2 Global is doing in Germany. So intermediary is buying the hydrogen from a supplier, and it is also selling it to the end users through auction mechanisms. So the huge advantage of this instrument is that it provides a very high level of investment security for producers and also for off-takers, especially since the purchase agreements are rather long. Disadvantage, and this has been pointed out, is indeed that it requires to take over much more risks and also liabilities of the public intermediary. So this basically means that handling the different contract periods of suppliers on the one side and off-takers on the other side requires a lot of expertise, it requires a lot of capacities. In other words, it will take more time. And I think we don't have the time, which is why we would suggest to kickstart indeed the European Hydrogen Bank with the supply side auctions. Yeah, since they actually, compared to the double-sided auction scheme, would provide us with stronger market orientation, and yeah, in general, the intermediary does not take over as much risk and liabilities as this would be the case in the double-sided auctions. Besides that, I think there are two more elements which deserve further clarification. One is what Bastian already mentioned, default guarantee. So basically an instrument for suppliers for risk hedging, especially for difficult to estimate default and delay risks. As Bastian pointed out, this can relate to transport infrastructure, import infrastructure, but also default by the hydrogen off-taker. If you think of an industrial plant, for example, which might just go bankrupt or needs to shut down the project. And this is obviously an investment risk for the supplier. And by providing such a risk hedging instrument, we can indeed untap further import potential in particular, and also import supplies to Europe, which otherwise might just not be explored or not be used, or might also not find their way to Europe if we don't use this instrument. And I think another point, maybe one more remark on the default guarantees. Our understanding is that in the but I'm also really curious to learn more about it from Ruud. Our understanding is that communication on the European Hydrogen Bank mentions the role of guarantees, especially in the context of the European Fund for Sustainable Development. It also touches upon the role of the European Investment Bank. And I think this can be used as an anchor point to further develop what is meant by such guarantees. And as I said, in our view, they should take the form of default guarantees for supplier. And what I think is to a certain extent missing in the communication, although it is mentioned, is further elaboration on the sustainability criteria for hydrogen production in third countries. And I think here it's really important to find a balance between, on the one side, the imports that are needed from a European perspective, and on the other side, the local production, the local consumption of green hydrogen and also of renewables, as well as incentives that are needed for economic and social benefits for EU partner countries. And I think this should take the form of a comprehensive hydrogen partnership, but we also need to specify what is meant exactly by sustainable hydrogen production in third countries. And I think elements to consider in this regard are the extent of decarbonization of the energy system, for example, water availability, which is very important, infrastructure and readiness for hydrogen of the infrastructure, and also the question whether the supplying countries should actually just be mere exporters of hydrogen or its derivatives, or should also export products which are already manufactured by the green hydrogen then to the EU. So basically, we need to discuss and determine with them together what should be their role along the value chain. Overall, I think the communication is really going in the right direction. We see a lot of synergies also with what we are suggesting in our report. And I think there's still room for clarification and also room for supplementing it by other important elements that have been mentioned in the communication, but should be elaborated further. And yeah, with that, I would hand it over to you again, Klaus-Dieter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernd, and also that you have already made the link to the next speaker, which is Ruud Kempener. So let's give the floor to the horse's mouth for the communication. And Ruud, thank you very much for joining us here today. I would also like to give you already a question from the audience with it, because it is a relevant question that you can already answer during your presentation, which is whether the Commission would also consider to expand the scope of the support for the domestic pillar of the hydrogen bank to low carbon hydrogen, or is it exclusively renewable hydrogen? Ruud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Klaus-Dieter, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. Indeed, my job has been made a little bit easier now that I've seen your report as well. And of course, I do agree that there are quite some synergies between your findings and what we published at the about 2 weeks ago on the European Hydrogen Bank. Of course, the most important first message is that the idea of the communication indeed is to have this public debate. To make sure that we already put out our ideas from the European Commission and then have the discussion with you to fill in indeed some of those details, while also providing you some sense of kind of the direction that we want to travel. So this is an excellent opportunity to exactly do that. Now, before I start and kind of present the ideas on the European Hydrogen Bank from our side, I also really want to kind of put some special attention to the fact that, of course, since last week, we also have an agreement on the Renewable Energy Directive here with member states and the European Parliament, which is essentially an essential part of the context of the European Hydrogen Bank. Our whole idea is that the European Hydrogen Bank will help to scale up the market for renewable hydrogen well before the targets kick in. And since last week, we actually have agreement on those targets. So that's an excellent piece of news. We now will have targets for the uptake of renewable hydrogen in industry, as well as binding targets for the uptake of renewable hydrogen in the transport sector. So with those two pieces of the legislative puzzle in place, the role of the European Hydrogen Bank is also becoming clear. It really is to help kind of help to sign those early takeoff agreements. Now I have one slide which presents essentially the overview of the European Hydrogen Bank, but I'm not sure if I can show that to you. So I will just simply kind of describe it to you. So the European Hydrogen Bank, in our view, has 4 different kind of activities underneath it. Now, 2 we've already discussed in length here. So one is a dedicated financing instrument to indeed kind of cover this green premium in the domestic market. Here we are relatively advanced and we are fully essentially in line with your recommendations. We are going to create a supply side auction where producers of renewable hydrogen have to find an off-taker, or at least and kind of have to have a letter of intent for an off-taker, whereby then the bank will cover the premium between the higher production costs of the producer and the possibility for that off-taker to pay for that renewable hydrogen. We will initially focus on renewable hydrogen exclusively in the domestic market. There is also a very important reason for that, of course, and that is that what the green premium is going to do is, of course, cover also some of those additional operational expenditure that you have if you're producing green hydrogen, which is essentially the higher cost of the renewable electricity that you need for the production of that renewable hydrogen. So the OPEX support, the green premium support, will also help to bring in more additional renewable power generation, which we will need not only for the production of hydrogen, but also to reduce our dependence on the imports of natural gas from Russia, not only in the electricity sector, but also in the end-use sectors. So there's a clear focus there on renewable hydrogen. Internationally, we are also indeed introducing a new auction instrument, and following actually your report as well, our intention is also to do supply side premiums there as well. So that would mean that international producers will have to find off-takers within Europe, and then the auction would be able to cover kind of the cost differential between those production costs and what the off-taker pays within Europe. Now, the reason why we indeed chose this supply side auction is quite similar to what you've described in your paper. So one of them is speed. We do think that it's really important to start and give a good signal already today that we can kind of start importing those import flows within the EU. So speed is a very important element. The second one is synergies. We do think that there are also synergies to be created between the domestic auctions that we are going to organize and the international auctions, especially in terms of the implementation of those auctions. So having synergies between those two supports instruments is another important element that we've had in mind. The third one, why we're also looking at supply side auctions, is that we already see interests from off-takers within the EU to sign these off-take agreements. So we already see in our discussions with the stakeholders that people are already looking for signing those off-take agreements. So there is already a market there for signing these longer term off-take agreements. And what this supply side auction design does is it essentially takes advantage of that demand already being out there and helping to enable those early movers to sign those off-take agreements. Now, we indeed say that in the depending on, of course, the results of the first auctions, we can also look into setting up an intermediary to sign these off-take agreements. And two reasons for that is, first of all, we'll have to see what the successes of the supply side auctions. You know, will the supply side auctions will they be sufficient in covering all of the risks? If this is not the case, then indeed we would have to go into a situation where we have to set up an intermediary to cover more of those kind of not cost-related risks. So that's one of the reasons that we want to try the supply side auctions first. The second one, of course, is that if you want to set up an institution intermediary, there are also a number of institutional steps. Those institutional steps simply take time. So this is something that we of course do not need to pursue afterwards. We can pursue it in parallel. But since we want to start early, this is why we want to have a look at the supply side auctions first. A third element is coordination and transparency. We are currently in a situation where already over the last 2 years, we've actually received quite a lot of information about where is demand, where is the supply taking place, including through the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. But we're now at a crucial phase where we have to start prioritizing what infrastructure is needed to bring that hydrogen from the producers to the consumers. And here, in order to prioritize that hydrogen infrastructure, we need to know which projects come first, which projects come later, what is the certainty that those projects will happen. And we think that through the results of both auctions, we will have a much better idea of kind of what are the first corridors that we will see happening within the EU. So those could be, of course, on the one hand side, first on-site supply and demand, which will take place, but also potential transport corridors between different industrial clusters within the EU. Having that information, making it more transparent, as well as the results of the auctions, we think will give more certainty to the commercial players to kind of start developing their projects and trying to find their own off-takers at the same time. Now, the fourth set of activities are linked to the existing financing instruments that are already in place. If you look at the project financing that we're doing within the EU, we already have, I would say, close to 20 billion euros of project financing taking place through the different kind of instruments. And on top of that, we also have InvestEU, which through the development banks, including the EIB, but also the other banks, are already providing guarantees for projects. So that is already all in place. At the same time, we're doing something similar for international projects. So we have a financing, European budget financing in place, which provides concessional loans. It provides blending, but it also provides guarantees already to projects in third countries. And via the implementing partners that we have, which again includes the EIB, but also the EBRD and other development banks, we already seeing that there's actually quite a big project pipeline of projects in third countries which are asking for those guarantees. So the demand is already out there. Now, what we want to do with the European Hydrogen Bank is to help to kind of not replace these instruments, but help to streamline them. And it's actually interesting. One of the elements that we did not explicitly mention, but that is definitely something which we have in mind, is to see if whether those guarantees that we both supply domestically as well as internationally, whether we can make them a bit more standardized. At the moment, those guarantees are often kind of negotiated on a project basis, and they're negotiated by different kind of implementing agencies. So the EIB is doing it, the EBRD is doing it, etc. So there we think that, of course, in an initial phase, they might need to be tailored to the specific projects. But as we get more and more projects and more experience, whether we can indeed start standardizing those guarantees across the different projects. And another element, which I think is very important, is to see if we can start developing an interaction between the different kind of instruments. So, for example, would it be possible to provide guarantees for projects such that they can do the project financing? But then once they have, for example, an offtake agreement, possibly supported by the European Hydrogen Bank, whether then those guarantees could be kind of recycled and start being used for other projects. So to really start looking at the synergies between, on the one hand side, the auctions that we are organizing, and on the other hand, the existing financing instruments that we have for both project financing and guarantees, to create much more synergies between the different kind of instruments. The other element, and that's why you have a lot of arrows on this slide as well, is that we have already quite a lot of information through the project financing that we are collecting. So again, there, using the data from the project financing, what part of that can we make publicly available, again, so that we can start kind of, at least at an aggregate level, or not at an aggregate level, but at a public level, give the market the confidence in terms of what projects are really already moving from concept phase into final investment decisions, and which of those will be kind of coming in at what point in time, such that we can start also on the demand side and the infrastructural side, prioritize our engagements. So this is what we've put in place in March this year. Our intention on the domestic market is already very clear. We're going to have another workshop with stakeholders in May, and we want to have the first kind of tender designs up for discussion somewhere around the summer, with the first auction, the pilot auction, already taking place in autumn. Now, for the international auctions, we will be trailing a little bit behind, but at the same time, we'll also take advantage of what we're doing in terms of the domestic market. So have, on the first of all, kind of identify the specific budgets that we can use for that, but also then have, following the budget considerations, have these discussions with stakeholders again, which we already had in the beginning of the end of February, to really kind of home in on the specific design criteria for the supply side auctions. Now I'm going to close my input with a quick response already to Bernd, and that is indeed that in our communication we are already referring to the sustainability criteria, which will be important, especially also for the international leg. And this was indeed a feedback that we already received from member states and some of the stakeholder workshops that we were doing. And of course, also from our experience already doing sustainable development project financing in third countries. So there again, this is essentially a call for further discussions to really fill out those details. So with that, I'm going to close and hand it back to you, Klaus-Dieter.
Thank you very much, Ruud. I have two questions for you, which I will pose now. The first was, does the Commission also consider to support low carbon hydrogen, or is it only on the domestic pillar, at least, is it only renewable hydrogen? That's the first question. Easy to answer, I suppose.
Yeah, the answer is no, it will only be renewable hydrogen for now domestically, and also renewable hydrogen internationally. And that has to do indeed with the bank and especially this auction also providing essentially operational support to the projects. That means that financing then goes through to the essentially source of energy, which is the renewable energy needed, the additional renewable energy needed for the production of that renewable hydrogen.
Thanks. And the other question is, if you do the infrastructure needs assessment, will that also highlight the import routes from non-EU areas?
Yes. So we are currently in a process on which is called the Trans-European Network for Energy, where we have received a lot of projects, up to 180 hydrogen projects, infrastructure projects, which not only include pipeline, but also storage and terminals. So one of the elements there that we need to do is to start prioritizing those particular projects. Now, they all have a cross-border element to it, which means that it's not only between member states, but it could also be from ports that we have within the EU to other countries within the EU, delivering that hydrogen from those ports to those countries. Now, here in most cases, for the cross-border projects, we're looking at hydrogen. But of course, for the imports, especially initially, we will also be looking at derivatives. So what are the potential derivatives that can be delivered by ships to our ports? And what does that mean then for the volume of hydrogen arriving at those different ports and the consequences for infrastructure for bringing either those derivatives or reconverting those derivatives into gaseous hydrogen to the end consumer? So that will be indeed a very important part of those assessments. And we actually just published together with the joint undertaking a new study on kind of the volumes of hydrogen expected, the hydrogen demand expected in and around ports in Europe.
And if you now take into account these production hubs in third countries and the routing, how will you guarantee that these hubs will actually deliver what they promised, especially when they also receive the support via the Hydrogen Bank or even by member states like the H2 Global from Germany? Is there an idea what could you impose on them in order to make sure that they deliver what they promise?
Yes, that's of course a very important element. So one of the interesting aspects, of course, where we now started with is that in the free trade agreements that we are negotiating, we have now for the first time actually with Chile a very specific chapter on kind of the trade of hydrogen from third countries with Europe. So on the trade side, we are working on that. On the specific instrument side, the advantage, of course, of the supply side auction is that as we're doing domestically, the support will only be delivered for every kilo being delivered to the off-taker. So different from project financing, you do not give the financing up front, but it really is paid for once the hydrogen is actually being delivered to the ports in Europe. So that, of course, takes away some of that risks. In the assessment, for example, you also looked at kind of demand side auctions. This, of course, is also a potential model that we looked at. But of course, on the demand side auctions, it might be more difficult to eventually guarantee for the project developers that they are being paid over the period that they need in order to repay their financing. So that's also, I saw in your kind of results that you kind of put the kind of the demand side auctions on the side. Also from our side, we think that the supply side auctions are going to be more effective in kind of the at least the projects of the ground, and then making sure that those projects are going to be delivering to the off-takers that are needed.
Thank you very much, Ruud, for the moment. And these are already questions on the implementation, and that brings us to Corinna, who will tell us a bit more about opportunity and challenges for the implementation of the bank. Corinna, your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Klaus-Dieter. Let me just see whether I can share my screen. No, I can't see it. But never mind. Oh, Bastian, can you share it maybe? And I can already start because I don't have access. Sorry. No, that's the wrong one. Okay.
1 second.
Oh, never mind. Let me maybe, I thought of, well, what is the looking forward towards the implementation of the European Hydrogen Bank? Of course, there's quite a few open issues, and I mean, that has also been highlighted in the communication, that not everything is fixed in stone, but I've just been thinking about, what are the opportunities and challenges along that way? And I think one big opportunity of the envisaged supply side auction is indeed avoiding complexity We believe it's an instrument that can be implemented relatively quickly and is a relatively simple instrument. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, has been said several times already, but we think it's a good idea to go for supply side auctions and see whether they work, and not go to a complex solution as double-sided auction as a first step. We also see the opportunity that this will have visibility in the EU and beyond, also for importing countries to actually, I mean, that's also mentioned in the communication, to provide price discovery and the first step towards a price index, so that actually also market actors know, well, this is kind of the European price for hydrogen or its derivatives. And this can provide good market orientation. Another advantage the European Hydrogen Bank may provide is that could reduce transaction costs. It's mentioned in the communication that, under the term auction as a service, so actually auctioning by the Commission could be offered to other member states, especially smaller member states, to use that auction scheme and not set up their own individual schemes, which would kind of prevent a further fragmentation of the support landscape in Europe. I mean, remains to be seen whether that is actually used, but I think there is an opportunity behind that if the hydrogen bank is implemented quickly and smoothly. More looking at the challenges, again, that was mentioned, I think there is a challenge around the funding gap that still occurs. I mean, the first auction round for the domestic branch is 800 million euro. And I think generally for the domestic one, from what we understood, there's a budget reserved of 3 billion. But again, the Commission communication says a total 90 to 115 billion will be needed to cover the cost gap for the 20 million renewable hydrogen. So that's 10 million domestic and 10 million import. So quite a large funding gap that would have to be covered through additional funding sources. And I mean, there is a midterm review also of the MFF, but also to be discussed, are there, like, where is this funding actually supposed to come from? Because I think on the other hand, if the European Hydrogen Bank stays very small, then there is a risk that it's not considered significant and not becoming kind of the lighthouse instrument that it could be. Another challenge I see going forward is a smooth and simple implementation. So, as said, I think it's a good idea that a relatively simple scheme was chosen, at least for the domestic branch with a supply side auction. On the other hand, we also have to see that so far there's quite limited experience with running competitive auction with Commission institution or EU agency. So SINEA, which is mentioned for the domestic branch and possibly also for the international one. I mean, so far they typically provide funding or grants on a cost and milestone basis. So there's grant agreements that are closed with beneficiaries, but it's a different scheme than a competitive auction, where you basically you don't provide a lot of details, but rather, I don't know, bid and completion bonds, and then there's penalties, and it's in our view, and as we have worked on auction design quite a lot, there's still quite a gap between how these type of funding schemes work and how competitive auctions work, and doesn't say that this can't be overcome. So, but I think it will be important that these EU auctions are implemented in a simple and accessible way. Otherwise, they also wouldn't be attractive to member states to be used as auction as a service. And yeah, finally, I think a challenge more along the way of implementation will be to look for a balanced distribution of funds. So just remains to be monitored, like which sectors will the supported hydrogen go to? Is it really the priority sectors? And also the geographical balance of beneficiaries and off-takers. I mean, I think it's great that it's a European scheme, so in that sense, anybody can participate. If you see along the way there's like clustering to just 1 or 2 countries, then again that might raise issues about fairness and balanced distribution. But I think, I mean, those are also challenges that can be solved along the way. So it's great that there is a scheme that will be tested and will do a first step to get the market going. So that much maybe just for looking at the way forward of implementing the hydrogen bank. Back to you, Klaus-Dieter.
Thank you very much, Corinna. I think you have raised a number of very important issues when it comes to the implementation, and we might follow up on 1 or 2 in the question and answers. But before that, I would like to hear Marco Alvera's view. Marco, you have heard now a lot what the hydrogen bank should do, can do. You have seen for both now the privileged design option is the supply side auction. You have heard already it will be limited to renewable, etc. You have heard Corinna pointing to some implementation issues. You as a CEO of a company that is deeply involved in the hydrogen business, and I would like you also to tell those who are not so familiar with the company TES, where your main business options are. How do you see when you have listened here to what the hydrogen bank might do? How do you see that from the pure business perspective as a company? Are you looking forward, or do you see also problematic areas when it comes to the operational way of the hydrogen bank?
Thanks very much, Klaus-Dieter. Thanks for having me. And it's very exciting how fast things are moving. And as an entrepreneur now, having moved from manager to entrepreneur, I have to see the opportunity in a bigger way, but also the problems in a very pragmatic way. So I think the short answer to your question is there's a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of hurdles in how we define these support mechanisms. So for those of you who don't know me, I invested when I was the CEO of SNAM almost €1 billion in different hydrogen technologies, buying companies manufacturing electrolyzers, testing hydrogen in pipelines and storage. And I then decided to join forces with Paddy Padmanathan, the CEO of Aqua Power, who very recently took NEOM, the world's biggest green hydrogen project, to make ammonia, to FID a few weeks ago for $8.5 billion with Aqua and Air Products. I stepped down from SNAM and Paddy stepped down from Aqua. We created a company called Zero, and our first project is TES, where I'm the CEO, as Klaus-Dieter said. And our intuition for TES is that in order to speed up the hydrogen revolution, which is the title of my hydrogen book, we need to use existing infrastructure. And before I was a believer in blending and how to blend pure hydrogen and natural gas, and eventually switch to a direct natural gas pipeline backbone, I'm now more and more convinced that we can use synthetic methane and use CO2 as a perfect hydrogen carrier. It's a very old technology called Sabatier. If you put green hydrogen and CO2 together in the Sabatier reaction, it's very efficient from an energy point of view and from a cost point of view. So this allows us to essentially break the chicken and egg dilemma. close this funding gap very significantly, because at that point we really need to, for a short period of time until we scale up the manufacturing of electrolyzers, fund, and for us it's indifferent if it's on the side or on the supply side. I think the supply side will explain why in a second, but our technology makes the funding gap much shorter, makes the scalability much faster, because essentially you're transforming hydrogen with all its problems of being illiquid, hard to price, hard to insure, hard to bank, hard to figure out what infrastructure will be used, hard to store and transport and ship. You're turning the beautiful hydrogen with all these problems into methane. And so you can piggyback all the existing benefits of methane. It's bankable, transportable, storable. But my comments will apply also to ammonia, and Zero will do other ammonia projects. So we are technology neutral, and we're just big believers in the opportunity to scale up green hydrogen. We're operating internationally, and we are very active in the United States as a production hub, in Europe, of course, in North Africa, and in Australia and the Middle East. We're backed by some of the world's largest companies and investors, and we are accelerating some of our own FIDs. So we're looking within the next 12 months to take big FIDs on projects that will produce for tests this ENG, electric natural gas. Just to give you an idea, to produce 200,000 tons, excluding the renewables, just focused on the electrolyzers and the Sabatier, is about $2 billion, depending on where you are in the world, how much wind and how much sun you have. So quite a lot of capex for a relatively small amount of volume. This is true for all of green hydrogen. The benefit, though, is that the costs will come down over time, and the unit cost is already quite cheap. So coming to what we're working on, the green ENG or the green hydrogen will need to really have certificates of origin, and the certification process needs to be well defined. The RFMBO targets that Europe is setting itself will mean that the supply will be shorter than the demand for a period of time. So it will be a seller's market. It will be very difficult to scale up the manufacturing. I just see how tight the bottlenecks are on the electrolyzer availability, and to find the ideal sites where you can get, even outside of Europe, the permitting done in time, all the rules that you need, the infrastructure that you need. It's just going to take time, and 2030 is around the corner. So coming now to being a little more specific, I have two areas of comments. The first I haven't heard enough today about is how we scale up the electrolyzer factories. I invested a lot of money. I went to visit probably a dozen factories. Most of them, if not to say all of them, are still subscale. And this is really where the bottleneck is. This is where we got it wrong 15 years ago, when we put 1,000 billion euros of solar subsidies in Europe, accumulated over many years, and all the manufacturing went to Asia, to China, really. This is really where I think a concerted effort, it doesn't take much to build an electrolyzer factory. This is much simpler than batteries. You don't need lithium. You don't need a lot of the rare earths. There's a lot of misconception here. We can do some pretty simple alkaline basic electrolyzers with basic materials, and we can scale it up and bring the costs way down. If we bring the cost down, we'll have made that funding gap even shorter. And so this is an area where I think we need to do more about. When it comes to the specifics of the policy ideas and proposals and decisions that I've heard today, I think the one-sided auction is much better, just from a practical point of view, for the types of large-scale projects that we're doing. I need to transact with someone. I need to find a customer that lends me his balance sheet, exactly like Air Products did with Aqua Power and Neom. They committed a 30-year period to buy ammonia at a fixed price. That's the only way this $8.5 billion project got 75% debt financing with 26 banks involved. Absent a big off-taker with a big balance sheet, it will be virtually impossible to get the type of banks to approve these projects. And that's really what we need. 3 or 4 or 5 big projects to break the ice, and then the banks will follow, will get more used to it. The only way I can get that offtake is by not having an intermediary. If I have this dual-sided auction system, or what H2 Global is thinking about, I think that's great for smaller volumes and smaller markets. But I essentially, in these first projects, need my customer to come with me and take a little bit of the FID risk. There's so much inflation in the market, it's so uncertain. So every bid I do in an auction pre-FID, I still won't know exactly how much the project will cost and how much the product will cost. So there needs to be some buffering of that kind of, not construction risk, I can take that. But today, some of these first of a kind projects really need some buffering on the FID. So I think the one-sided auction works, and I think being on the supply side helps, as Mr. Kempener was saying, on making some of the bankability easier in the event of default. Absent of default, it's not really different if it's supply or demand, because you're going to be sharing between the producer and the buyer somewhat that subsidy. I think there's a lot of opportunity as well as concerns, but also opportunity around the IRA and other support mechanisms, because I think the moment you get the IRA to apply to exports, this is good, at least from my point of view, for the molecules coming to Europe subsidized by the IRA. Still question how the combination of different incentives can work at the national level, whether it's H2 Global, at the European level, with the Hydrogen Bank, with the EIB's own initiatives, with the ECA's own initiatives, with the World Bank and other kind of concessionary capital for developing parts of the world. I think there's a lot of coordination needed, but everything is going faster than expected, and I think in the right direction. The final reflection is more strategic, really start with the end in mind, and I think there's not enough of a discussion, and I think it surfaced a few times in Corinna's document as well as previously. What are we solving for? Like, if we want to compete with the Middle East or Texas or Australia in terms of sunshine in Europe, we've lost that competition. And the cost of moving molecules from Australia or even North Africa to Europe is only like 10, 15 euros a megawatt hour. So we shouldn't worry about trying to create the most competitive hydrogen production hub in Europe, because absent Spain and maybe some parts of Sicily or Portugal, it just won't happen. We kind of lost that. But that's good news, because there's a lot of sun available. Are we going to work to defend making green ammonia in Europe? Why should we? I mean, that's another kind of basic transformation of kind of sunshine to a product. We're better off importing that. Do we want to protect the auto industry and the high precision steel conversion that we do, and some of the cement that we need for local purposes, and a lot of the strategic industry, maybe even around defense and technology? Indeed, I think we should, and I think there's a lot of jobs that we can save and create. But Europe was built around a coalition of coal and steel. If we've knocked out the coal and we don't replace it quickly, then it will be a domino effect, and we will, if we lose the steel industry, we lose the auto industry, we lose the plastics industry. So I think there's a real urgency to define what sectors are strategic. I'm less worried about geographies, because I think within Europe we are a union, so it doesn't really matter to me where within Europe, but certainly to have a conversation of which sectors we try to subsidize and support and protect and help foster and grow. I think that's a conversation to be had. But really betting on electrolyzer manufacturing here, big scale, large scale, is a very low cost strategic investment that will help not only Europe, but the rest of the world get access to cheaper green hydrogen.
Thank you very much indeed, Marco. We are opening now the discussion session. You as participants here, you can raise your hand, then you can ask your question directly via the screen, or you can put it also into the chat box. I will follow it and will then ask the question. I will start with a question because, Marco, you have just mentioned the scaling up of the electrolyzer manufacturing. And indeed, this is a big problem, but it's only the one side of the same coin. And the other side is the electrolyzers. Even if you are now fast scaling up the electrolyzer manufacturing, then you will put them into operation, and they operate with renewable electricity. Are you confident that if you are scaling up these electrolyzers fast, that the supply of renewable electricity will follow?
Yeah, I think they both go together. I mean, I think a lot is happening around the world already on solar panels here in Italy, in Asia, of course, in the US. That's kind of easier because the market is bigger, and I think the kind of IP of solar is in a way in the right hands. I think with the electrolyzers, we really need the industry and policymakers really need to go a level deeper and understand, alkaline, what you can do. Because if you look at large scale projects, you kind of need alkaline, and how do you scale that up while we invest in R&D and solid oxide? I think both, but I have no doubt that the renewable energy will be there, because there's a lot of projects that have already purchased the solar panels and are still waiting for grid connectivity. So there's some quick wins. Really, the bottleneck is in the electrolyzers right now.
Thanks. And then there's a leftover question to Ruud from Ana Valverde Serrano. She wants to know, Ruud, how would double-sided auctions operationalized for imports? Would it be the Commission doing it, or would member states taking the risks in the last place?
Yes, indeed. In terms, if we would organize a double-sided auction, that essentially means that the offtake agreement will be signed by an EU institution. Now, that also means that the EU budget is then behind that, and so it would indeed be in this particular case, the European Union, which would take that risk. Now, one of the things that we proposed also in the communication to explore is whether we can use what is so-called Team Europe approach. Now, this Team Europe approach essentially means that you are going to kind of pool financing funding from member states together with EU budget. Now, that pooling can be done for both of the options that we presented. So you could do that pooling for the supply side auctions, but you could also do this pooling for a double-sided auction. And already today, the German H2 Global initiative does already that. It already has, I think, the Netherlands now joining their initiative. So again, there it would be then the member state which takes that particular risk. Of course, depending on how you design it, you could make sure you could organize it in such a way that each member state does its specific part, or pull it all together. But these are indeed the discussions that you still need to have.
Thank you very much. Daniel Freil, you have a question. You can answer it directly. Ask it directly.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for organizing this very interesting discussion. Building on what Mr. Alvera mentioned about keeping the competitiveness of European electrolyzer industry alive and not repeating the mistakes of PV and others, was wondering whether, because I haven't heard today, whether you are assessing the possibility of including some requirements, non-price requirements on the auction system to highlight some benefits and some values which would put the European electrolyzer industry in a competitive advantage. I think that's something that we, from the Association from Hydrogen Europe, which I'm representing, something that we have been proposing at least to explore, maybe not with the first auction, but to go into that direction, to ensure that we just don't go only on price and we end up only with a Chinese product. And I think we've seen this in the wind sector, where now they are considering more and more the non-price requirements to be also part of the auctioning. And it would be good to already address that early in the process and not wait too long. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. I consider these questions asked to all panelists, so please come in. Who wants to answer first? Ruud, I see.
Yes, maybe. I mean, it's not a coincidence, of course, that we published the European Hydrogen Bank alongside the Net Zero Industry Act. And of course, the Net Zero Industry Act has specifically in mind to identify for example, the manufacturing of as electrolyzers as one of those areas where strategic projects are important. So where we really need to make sure that manufacturing is scaled up. So there's no coincidence there that those two came out exactly at the same time. Now, the other element indeed that we put forward there, and that is still, of course, in our proposal, is to see whether you can also start looking at kind of having, besides the price, other non-price criteria associated, including criteria which can be associated with ensuring the security of your supply chains. Again, our proposals are there. These will be discussed. Our first auction, especially on the domestic side, will be a pilot auction. It really will be about, okay, let's see what kind of projects we are going to get in there at European scale, and that will certainly determine kind of what what the next auction will look like. And actually, just while we were speaking, I just saw that we've now published our first specifications for your feedback. That took place today. So they are now published actually online. And so we will ask everyone, I think the deadline is before the 11th of May to have a look at that. And if you haven't received it, then let me know, and we can share the link with you.
Anybody else? No, that's not the case. Then let me continue to ask questions. I'm waiting still for questions coming in. I would first look at what Corinna has raised with regard to the financing gap. The financing gap is big. We have the de-risking of the hydrogen project. We have to bring in capital costs down. We have to leverage private capital, and that all leads us to the hydrogen bank with a presumed capital of 3 billion. And again, is that really a figure, an amount that will really be sufficient in order to do that? I have heard from Marco, if you are concentrating the first auctions on really big projects, I mean, the first auction, Ruud, is about 800 million yet you want to put in there for the internal domestic leg, I suppose. But that's already almost a third, more than a third of the whole thing. So you will not get very far with this amount. And also the leveraging it, as Marco has said, the private banks will follow once the first auctions have successfully been done. So how do you see that? And that's a question to everybody. Or is the amount not the real problem here? Is it more the operational kind of work that the hydrogen bank will deliver? As Ruud has explained, it's not only the financing issue, it is also the coordination issue and the transparency issue, etc., etc. So how do you see that? Is it overestimated, the problem that it is not enough money to support, or is it a problem?
Okay, should I start?
I think Bernd was first, then Marco.
Yeah, but happy to hear your views on this as well, Marco. But just, you know, to contextualize this a little bit, 3 billion euro is definitely not a lot of money, especially not if we're considering this to be the budget for the domestic side and the import side. If you compare it to the H2 Global scheme in Germany, I think they are endowed with now more than 4 billion. And this is just for the import side. So, and when we look at the numbers in terms of investment that we actually need, I mean, rough estimation would be 1,300 billion euros to fulfill our targets of the for imports and domestic production. So this is definitely not a lot of money. However, having said that, I think it's it's good to have this mechanism in place, to have this mechanism working, and also to deliver on some projects. But I think, and I don't know how you see this, Marco, from a business side, but I think that we might not only need to see a scale up of hydrogen in general, but also a scale up of the budget for the European Hydrogen Bank if we want to achieve the target.
Marco?
Yes, so I think we need to really separate three elements. First is the capital that's needed to build this stuff, which is huge because it's just very capital intensive. The difference compared to the conventional energy is that this energy system, the marginal cost and the operating cost are zero. I mean, the energy cost is zero because the marginal source is zero. So it's mainly about CapEx. Once the CapEx is there, then of course you have some maintenance, but the system cost can go lower and lower and lower over time. So you're kind of making a one-off investment in the CapEx. The beauty is that there's a lot of liquidity out there to go to these types of projects, provided that they are bankable. And to make it bankable, it's about the price difference, it's about the longevity of the offtake, it's about some insurance, it's about some guarantees of performance. And all these things are non-cash. A lot of these things are non-cash items, where I think the Commission could be very, very impactful without having to write big checks. The lower the cost of capital for these projects, the cheaper the energy will be available in Europe. And if you put this into the context, of course, of the fossil fuel subsidies we've seen last year, or of other items, on a yearly basis, it's not so expensive, but it's such a strategic piece of what we're trying to do. And once the infrastructure is there, I always say this is like building the Roman aqueducts. The water in the Trevi fountain comes from stuff that was built 2,000 years ago. This is like, the forever infrastructure. Of course, electrolyzers will get cheaper and cheaper, panels will get more and more efficient, but that kind of connectivity is a permanent one. So I think there needs to be really a strategic discussion around, as I said, the manufacturing and the technology, but also how do we build this infrastructure in 5 or 10 years instead of 15, 20, 25 years, which is what the market would do without a policy nudge. And this is really where the Commission, the Hydrogen Bank, H2 Global, the EIB, the EBRD, the World Bank, maybe a kind of a sliver of the VAT on fossil fuels in Europe could be dedicated to this every year. So all the pieces are there, and I think the debates like this are very constructive.
Thank you very much. H2 Global has been mentioned a couple of times now. I would be interested to hear how you see the relationship also in future between the Hydrogen Bank and H2 Global. Is there a risk that we could see that these two institutions would cannibalize each other? Or is it that is directed to Ruud when you are saying in the communication that the Commission could consider to extend the Innovation Fund auctions to a platform as a platform to member states? Is that already something where you would see how to combine rather to cannibalize, how to combine these initiatives? And the third that I would like to put into the same question is, how do you see the chances, the possibilities with the experiences that you might now gain through the demand aggregation and joint purchase of natural gas platform, that this could be also be one of the possibilities for the future development of the demand aggregation and joint purchasing of renewable hydrogen. So that's a complex. I don't know who would like to start. Ruud.
Yeah, I could give it a go. So first of all, I think in the last half a year, essentially following the announcement of our president, of course, we've had lots of the discussions with stakeholders, including with H2 Global, and I think from that perspective, it's clear that there's no way that these are competing instruments, and that is also not the intention of either of those instruments. including from the H2 Global side, which is also very keen to see how they can use that instrument already on an international level. So, at a European level, so to Europeanize that instrument. But the key question still is like, how do we ensure kind of added value? And I think that's very important for the European Hydrogen Bank. So we have a member state that already has kind of committed a substantial amount of financing to support kind of either imports or also imports into Germany, either from other European countries or internationally. So that member state has already made this commitment. What we have to make sure with the European Hydrogen Bank is that whatever we use as EU budget in principle really has added European value. And here we can actually piggyback on the experience that H2 Global already has, because they've done their first tender, they have their first kind of auction results already coming in. So actually before this, I was meeting with representatives to make sure that we kind of learn from their experience already. So there I really don't see any risks of cannibalization, really just making sure that we have added value wherever that is needed.
Thanks, Ruud. Anybody else?
Yeah, and then maybe
sorry.
on the EU energy platform that we have for gas. Now, first of all, these are very different markets. You can purchase natural gas. Now there is this production available, while there is, if you want to purchase renewable hydrogen, you essentially have to financing a project. So these are very, very different markets. However, the tools that we are going to use for the EU energy platform, which are really tools which are looking at, okay, a very disaggregated level, where is the supply coming in, where is the demand, what is the infrastructure needs that we require to get that gas to the end consumer. The tools themselves have, of course, certain features that could also be very interested for hydrogen. And then once the hydrogen becomes really a commercial market, then indeed you could start thinking about aggregating, but that will be something definitely not in the next couple of years.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else?
Yeah, maybe me. I would agree with Ruud that there isn't real competition, because I mean, if you look at the demand there is for hydrogen, or that there will be created also now through the Renewable Energy Directive and others, I mean, there's the challenge is huge, and it's actually good to have multiple instruments. And I think they can also learn from each other on how it works, what type of constructs will come up. Or I mean, I think H2 Global also has a more, will apply more criteria and be more selective in what type of derivative to use and what additional criteria to apply. So I think, will be interesting to learn from that, but it's not, I also wouldn't see it as a competition, but rather it's something maybe lessons learned can be applied.
Thanks a lot. I don't see any further question from the audience, and having a look at the clock, I think we are done with the webinar. I would really thank all the panelists. Marco, you have to leave. All the best. Thank you very much for having joined us here today. And also to the rest of you, thank you very much indeed. And with that, I will give the floor now for the closing remarks to Bernd.
Yeah, thank you very much, Klaus-Dieter. Thank you very much, everybody, for a truly insightful and timely debate with different perspectives, which turned out to be very helpful for understanding the challenge that we are facing better, the perspective from the Commission, perspective from research, also the experience from the business side. I would just like to highlight three buzzwords that I've picked up over and over again in our discussion, which are speed, which are synergies, and which is clarification. So I think time is at the essence, speed is at the essence. We've learned that we really need to encourage first movers when it comes to the ramp up of hydrogen. And I think that's a very pragmatic choice. We might not have the time for building up an intermediary. This is why we should go with the supply side auctions to kickstart the hydrogen bank. we should avoid, Corinna pointed it out, complexity to the extent that this is possible for the sake of accelerating the hydrogen bank, and also to keep the ambitious timeline that Ruud has outlined. When it comes to synergies, Ruud mentioned that there will be synergies between the domestic and the importing pillar. And he also mentioned that there will be synergies also when it comes to the need for infrastructure, as soon as we know which projects will go ahead. However, I think we also understood that there is still a need for clarification, for example, for standardizing guarantees when we move further along with the projects. Also clarification that was pointed out in the last bit of the discussion with regard to the role of H2 Global, or the added value that H2 Global and the European Hydrogen Bank can ensure. So I think there are still a lot of things to be clarified. Hydrogen will remain very high on the agenda of the Commission, that's for sure, of Europe, also of EPICO, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and Guidehouse. So I would once again like to thank our panelists, Corinna, Ruud, Marco, Kevin, and of course you, Klaus-Dieter, for guiding us through this discussion, and of course all the participants for joining us. And I very much hope to see you at the next event, when we will be discussing important building blocks of the hydrogen strategy for Europe. Thank you very much, and have a great Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.